Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Mokono Man at YouTube with another airbrush review. Another one lent by my friend. This is the low tier or the beginner cheaper airbrush, the U-STAR S130, which I suspect is just a Hiseng HS 30 or 130, whatever. So inside we've got our usual standard wrench, which looks suspiciously it looks familiar with its stamping. The foam is very thick. We've got our rubber hose connector, which is not connected, and the airbrush in question, which is pretty much the same from my experience, etched U-STAR. It's got the adjusting knob at the rear, and which I've never seen before, a rubber cap at the end of the crown. This one doesn't seem to be used before, so we have to make sure to take that off. Fitting and everything is really good. Disappointingly, it does not come with a guide or set of instructions. The case is, however, very nice. Hasn't cracked in shipping or whatnot, so this is a bit different. There's also a cutout for eyedroppers. They haven't included, though I believe U-STAR sells that separately. If you've bought this airbrush and watching this video, you're probably new to airbrushing, and the first thing you should always do is a full strip down to be familiar with the parts. If you are looking to buy an airbrush, this is just going to be more expensive than your typical Hiseng. Keep track of all the parts. The nozzle and the needle are the most fragile and they break easily, so we're going to put the nozzle aside. Now I've just pulled off the needle nut that holds the needle together. The assembly pulls backwards and forwards and pulls the needle out of the nozzle. This allows air to go through by holding it down and air passing underneath the chamber and dragging the paint out of the cup. What we're going to do is, because we've got metal on metal action rubbing up against each other, once pulled apart, we'll be lubricating the airbrush to allow for a smoother action, much like a more expensive airbrush. Now this is the guts of the internals that pulls it backwards and forwards. A little bit of spring, that goes there, and this is actually closer to a Sparmax than a Hiseng, so pretty much the old style. We've got a little brass T on the inside, so this is a very old design airbrush. Nothing like that's coming out of China nowadays, though. U-STAR is a Taiwanese brand, so instead of having this made by Hiseng, it probably came out of the Sparmax factory. More or less slightly better workmanship, and the electrocoating is quite nice and smooth, so this would just be a very old DH-103. We're now taking off the crown. The crown comes in two parts, and we've got the nozzle. Now the nozzle we have to be the most careful with. You come with a wrench. There is an absolute tiny thread on the inside. It's easy to take off and generally get quite a large amount of gunk built up. You want to pry that out, put it back together when you do maintenance. Put your needle through and see what's in the inside. Though we could tell that this is an absolute virgin brush. To demonstrate when you put it back on, you have to be very careful not to over torque it with the wrench, with the strength of your fingers. Being made out of brass, it will just shear and the thread will stay on the inside of the airbrush. If that does happen, don't fret. There is a tutorial on this video. So once you got some resistance, just with one finger, you slightly nudge it by about 1/10 of a turn, and there you go. You don't want it too loose, because if air leaks in there, it absolutely ruins atomization. Now, the next step, we're going to be utilising petroleum jelly and the Q-tip. Q-tips are very, very useful for the hobby. We're just going to glaze the tip a bit, not too much of a build-up, and lubricate the inside. Making sure that we're getting a nice even coating against the walls, the thread, at the O-ring. There you have a bit of a wall that's approximately here. There's a bit of a screw that you put a screwdriver down to open up, and you'll have a harder rubber plastic O-ring, and that protects paint flowing backwards out into the guts. In the chance that there is a leak, this lubricant is going to mix with the paint and you'll just have coloured lubricant. If it's just paint that's going back, your whole airbrush is going to seize and it will not work as you're spraying. At least you can finish the job and move on. So that's all done. Nice and lovely. The T-bit we're going to put in first, and this takes a bit of practice. You definitely do not want paint going down the air valve. We're just going to drop it in, and with the back of the needle I'm going to feed the back of the T-piece into the hole and push it. It takes a bit of practice. It is a bit frustrating for a first timer to assemble. That took no time at all. To find out if we've done that correctly, we screw on the air valve, we push down on the brass bit, and it's got a nice springy action. The next component is what I like to call the tongue. You want to go in a nice S shape, the little bit facing backwards, and you just gently lean it in there. With the air trigger, goes down in sideways, turn, and it's in. Lean backwards against the tongue. Very gently, you're going to put that down and leave that to the side. Got a bit ahead of myself. Put a bit of lubricant on top of the brass T-piece and seal around it just in case there is a bit of a paint leak. The next step is the pullback or the double action mechanism. All of this needs to be lubricated. What I like to do is hold it by the thread, as you don't need to lube that up, and just very liberally wipe it all over. Put the spring on, and it's very easy to lose as you put a little bit of tension on it and it just springs away. You always need a spring, or otherwise its default mode is not going to be in the closed position. That doesn't work out too well for us. A little bit of lubricant inside the hole. Put the whole assembly together. Bit of glazing on the thread. And this is going to be screwed in ever so gently. The tongue pushes up against the trigger and slowly screw into place until it stops. Gently to test it, pull back, and we can see the back mechanism going backwards and forwards in a very fluid, smooth manner. If there's any resistance, you put far too much lubricant. Next, we talk about the needle. The needle goes through the nozzle. If the needle is bent, paint is going to collect underneath that, grow in size, and then release and land in your model in chunks. So you're going to be very careful. We feed it through, and we keep pushing so gently until we have some resistance and it stops. And we've seen it go right through the nozzle. Do not put too much force. As you split the nozzle, that ruins atomization, and it's also going to split paint. So we're going to pull that back ever so slightly to put on the crown. Now, when you lose, the fit is really, really nice, by the way. So this is most definitely a Sparmax. Generally, when the nozzle wears out, you can put a bit of beeswax around there, and that improves atomization. Again, talking about air leaking through there. We close this assembly. We push the needle all the way through until it stops, and then we've got the needle nut, another part that gets lost easily. It tightens the thread, pulls back, pushes down, extremely smooth, and then we've got the cover to protect the inner assembly. Now, the beautiful thing about this mechanism is the tighter you pull it, the less it pulls back, so it works like a single action. You pull back, you push down, and you can achieve very, very fine lines if you're not too confident in your freehand ability. And this is your airbrush completely tuned. We're going to chuck some paint in it. We'll hook it up to a compressor via a hose. Just anything small like 12 volters or the benchtop compressors, and see how well it atomizes. We've flushed it out with thinner, though I forgot to do the nozzle seal test. We've got this hooked up to some air. When you push down, you should see no bubbles coming out of the cup. That means all the air is purely being used to siphon paint out of the cup and not going outwards and clogging that. As we pull back a bit, there's still no bubbles. So that is pretty good. Let's paint some lines. Now, I just need to get the air pressure feeling right. And the atomization is just as smooth as I remember from a new Sparmax. Though this is an old model DH-103 Sparmax. And that used to be my preferred airbrush. And it's performing just as well as I remember when I was using it in its prime. Generally, when you're doing very fine lines at a low PSI, it can be a bit choppy when you're spraying fast. Though if you go really slow, it's not too bad. It's a tad tricky when you're trying to do hairline stuff. Though once you start getting a bit thicker, a bit freehandy, it's not too bad at all. And it's very, very smooth. It's what we're already used to. We'll do some larger ones. Atomization's great. The spray pattern is very smooth. It's not too fuzzy on the edges. And you're able to do the gradient stuff. It's actually a bit too heavy for gradient stuff. I wouldn't personally do it with this. But it works out quite well. Generally, they're extremely cheap if you're shopping in Hong Kong, Taiwan, maybe Singapore. If you see these, for the equivalent of under $30 US, grab one or a couple. This is an excellent beginner's airbrush. This is the airbrush I pretty much started off and learned over the years to where I am at the moment. For maintenance, when you change colours, all you have to do is fill with thinner, wipe out the cup, and to know if your airbrush is clean, put your finger on the trigger or the nozzle, push down, pull back, and the water will change colour. Keep flushing until it's clear. For intermediate maintenance, you pull apart as described in the video. Make sure there's no gunk behind the nozzle, and for major maintenance, that's when soaking and whatnot will be required. There are many videos on this channel about that. Be mindful of the rubber O-rings, as it does have being an older model. An old-fashioned style airbrush. I am surprised it is still being made and still alive through the U-STAR line of model stuff. It is surprising as U-STAR copies a lot of Tamiya's stuff. It's contracted by the same people that does airbrushes. So realistically, buying a U-STAR airbrush is like buying a Tamiya style airbrush. It's practically coming from the same location. Out of the 3 airbrushes I've reviewed recently through the Iwata, the Mr. Hobby branded one, and this guy, this is my personal favorite. It's the best for a beginner, and realistically tuned right, it can dance with the Iwata, though generally the Iwata will last far longer in the long term. Mind you, my one did last a good part of a decade, even though it is slightly on the sad side. Nonetheless, I can't recommend it enough, especially if the price is very, very low for those in those parts of the world. It surprised the hell out of me. I've just sort of written it off by looking at it immediately, though doing a full pull apart as well as a test through the ringer is always worthwhile, even if you think there is 1,000 Hiseng clones running out there in the stratosphere. Nonetheless, these guys are the original gangsters and been going strong for a long time, so they're very safe to go by. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content. I've received another batch of airbrushes to review, even though I've finished with these 3, and we'll eventually get around to doing some honing your airbrush skill stuff, though there is a strong stock of those at the moment. Some of my airbrushes are getting an absolute thrashing, so a good maintenance hike is required. See you later, and thank you for watching.